Hi everyone, welcome again to VLGA Connect, and it's time for the weekly governance update, proudly brought to you by Hunt and Hunt Lawyers and starring Stephen Cooper of the VLGA. Hello Stephen.
Oh, hello Chris, only second to you. And is this the week in governance where nothing happened?
No, we're yet to come across that week. My list is quite long, so we should get cracking. You made the observation to me, quite rightly so, that we're in that period where councils are adopting their council plans because they had until the end of October. A few went earlier in the year, but
Yep.
there's a lot being adopted now, which is good.
There's a lot of work being done, and props to councillors, council officers, communities that got involved. That is seriously important strategic work that will stand those councils in good stead for the next 3 years of their term.
Have you got a sense of how many councils are calling their council plan a council plan still? Because it seems to me most have gone down the path of a community plan in title.
I think there's a healthy dose of creativity in the naming, Chris, which is to be applauded.
And all in support of those community visions of a 10-year or longer period as well, which is great to see. Steve, one of the stories that's attracted a lot of attention this week, and it played out over the course of about 5 days, was the CEO of Swan Hill, who's now resigned, but was subject of media speculation around his vaccination status.
Yeah, so, and that had been quite public, as you said, Chris, but I thought a couple of things. Well handled by everyone. It was clearly, for anyone who listened to our interview with Hunt and Hunt's Richard Scougal a couple of weeks ago, this question of vaccinations in the workplace and the industrial relations implications is not going to go away. And we might talk about that in another context later. So it was always going to be difficult for a CEO who had not been vaccinated to perform their role. But it also reminded me, Chris, of often we talk about those occasions where personal values clash with your organisational values or responsibilities. And, here's a live case. And I think credit to John McLinden for stepping away with the grace that he did.
Indeed, and it must have been under immense pressure for those few days, which shouldn't be ignored either. Steve, you reminded me of a famous case from about 6 years ago, which you could sort of equate in terms of, personal values conflicting with a professional responsibility.
The absolute poster child in this case is Kim Davis, the Kentucky County Clerk, who, contrary to state law, refused to officiate over same-sex marriages, and even in the face of a Supreme Court order, still refused and, in fact, went to jail for the privilege. Now, not everyone who has a clash between their personal and their organisational responsibilities is expected to kind of go to that extreme and be locked up. But it's a really good start, even with sort of some of the day-to-day things. If you don't actually agree with a policy or you've got a particular value or position, to actually understand that when you're at work, the position of the organisation is paramount, the values of the organisation.
You made me think of Darren Hinch then too, another famous case going back quite some years now. But there's a very fresh example playing out at the moment, Steve. Have you seen this? The Fair Work Commission Deputy President, who's expressed a view on vaccine mandates, has now been barred from considering or sitting on any matters relating to workplace vaccinations in the future.
And the Fair Work Commission President is anticipating that there'll be more of these cases coming before the Commission, and someone who's expressed such a strong personal view may well be conflicted, may well be, I suppose, accused of having an apprehended bias and not giving a fair hearing. So, as I understand, Chris, the Deputy President has been stood aside from any of those matters.
Yes, spoken social media apparently about public health measures implemented during the pandemic. I was interested to learn that the President of the Fair Work Commission doesn't have power to discipline members, but what the President has done is directed the Deputy President to attend training on responsibilities and standards of professional conduct expected of a member of a commission, and as we said, she'll be excluded from all and any further full bench work until she's completed that training, and has been disqualified on the grounds of bias from adjudicating disputes relating to workplace vaccinations in future.
Wow, there's a lot going on there, Chris. Actually, can I just segue, though, seeing as we're talking about social media, to the IBAC's Operation Turon report that was released this week, which is an unusual one because it doesn't necessarily point to the sort of corruption that we would normally expect IBAC to investigate, but at its heart is comments made on social media using a pseudonym.
Yes, social media rears its head in various ways, doesn't it? Here's another example. So, what's the lesson here? There's the one thing that jumped out at me is there's a policy gap, clearly, isn't there?
Yeah, let's just go back a step, Chris. So this was the matter of former Assistant Commissioner Brett Guerin, who it was found had used 3 pseudonyms to make comment at times around matters that were subject of police investigation. And what the IBAC did find in amongst a number of things was that certain of the comments relied on information derived from his role as a police member. I'll just digress for a moment, Chris. There is a line in Hamilton that's pretty apt, actually.
Yes, what is that?
There is. Who would have seen it? That when Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson were fierce rivals, and when Jefferson left the party to stand for president, Hamilton said, "All right, I'll use a pseudonym. You'll see what I can do to him."
Just like you to weave Hamilton in. It's been a while. So
Look, it has. I've missed it, but it sort of goes to the point, though, at times as to why don't people use their real names? Not necessarily about this, but more generally. So yes, and as you've just touched on, what the report identified was some policy gaps, which I think have been addressed in part already at VicPol, but also would be worth considering, and you'd imagine would be a trend in regard to use of social media by employees.
So it's been a week for reports, Steve. You've got that one. There's a lot of reading in the Operation Turon report. The Victorian Ombudsman has brought out her annual report this week. And sad to report that the most complained about public bodies over the course of that 12 months was local councils.
I heard the Ombudsman at a session a few weeks ago say that the top 2 were the prison system or the correction system and local government. And given that in any I'll call it a prison, there is a hotline where people can ring the Ombudsman. So it's no surprise that Corrections Victoria is complained about. It's also no surprise, and I think the Ombudsman touches on it, given the number of interactions that the community have with local government over a range of issues, that local government ranks highly. So, that's just part of the landscape, I suppose.
That's exactly what she said, Steve. And the issues complained about, she says, were similar to previous years, how councils communicated with ratepayers, followed by how the complaint was handled. And then she touches on the work she's done around good practice for complaints handling, as well as the review of financial hardship by ratepayers, which was another of the key topics affecting local councils that plays out in the Ombudsman's annual report, which is available for all to read, tabled in Parliament yesterday.
Yep. And Chris, the breadcrumb I noticed through the document was around human rights obligations. And I get the sense that the Ombudsman is alert to her responsibilities as, I guess, the venue for complaints about human rights. So this won't go away. It also points to a question of competency, I suppose, for any public sector employee. Now, I might be oversimplifying this because I'm not a human rights specialist, but my understanding is there is only one of the human rights that is unalienable, and that's the one about cruel, inhumane treatment and torture type stuff. And I'll just leave it out there that human right shouldn't be compromised by any other public interest. Draw your own conclusions. Other human rights might be read in conjunction with where is the public interest, but what that also suggests is that any public official in making a decision that affects someone's human rights needs to go through an analysis as to whether that human right is outweighed by the public interest. And the simple example being people have a human right to free movement, but in the interests of public safety, government's allowed to say you're only allowed to drive on the left-hand side of the road.
And the other example I think that was referred to a lot was the housing issue during the pandemic and those particular housing sites that were locked down very quickly. And she makes a few points about the human rights implications of those decisions.
Yeah, and I think in that sense, Chris, I mean, there's been a few matters that have, in this COVID time have gone to the Supreme Court of Victoria, and the court has ruled on the side of government typically. But it would be really good to see a very public exposure of how organisations, weigh up those decisions about the public interest versus human rights.
While we're talking about the Ombudsman, Steve, don't become the headline.
Yes. In fact, a terrific workshop on earlier in the week. The days are all a blur, Chris. I think it might have been Wednesday. We had the Ombudsman, Commissioner Redlick from the IBAC, who I've just been talking about, and Andrew Greaves, the Auditor General. I guess the biggest takeaway for me out of that was particularly some comments made by the Commissioner in regard to behaviours that mask corruption in the public sector, and a fabulous little diagram around employees sometimes indirectly falling into corruption, colleagues not acting as they should, supervisors not providing an environment where issues can be recorded or where people will take a blind eye. The one that was really telling, I want to come back to, is around internal governance and basically the culture set by senior leadership. So a really, I guess, whole of organisation approach being required to overcome this, Chris.
Question without notice, is that a webinar that is accessible for watching back, do you know?
Chris, I'm not sure, but I presume so. It's under the heading of "Don't Become the Headline." So I think a search will actually find that. One point I wanted to make, there was a rather excellent question, and I'm going to risk editorialising here for a moment, at the end of the session about what about where those internal controls that we've got are under-resourced. And it's really a risk in a rate capping environment where we don't cut services, but we cut what we might otherwise call overhead. So we don't have adequate contract management, procurement, governance teams are stretched, risk and OHS, finance department not doing that kind of review work that they should. Some comments made there that it's really important for organisations to make sure that that second line of defence in our risk framework is adequately resourced.
Sounds like it should be something on the agenda of everybody's next audit and risk committee, Steve.
Could be, Chris. You know people.
Now, there's another report, probably the last one, and of course this was a subject of discussion on today's excellent VLGA Connect panel with Michael Stefanovic, David Wolfe and Julie Reid, and it's the Local Government Inspectorate's review of personal interest declarations of Victorian councillors. Some pretty stunning numbers here, Steve. 650 councillors at 78 councils. Their return activity was reviewed between October 2016 and February 2020, and it was found that 2 out of every 5 councillors failed to disclose interests in one or more of their returns, or failed to submit a return at all. That's starting to sound like there's a real issue here.
I was stunned by the numbers when I read the report earlier in the week, Chris, and nothing at that rather excellent panel changed the stunning nature of the stat. So it's an important topic, and as was mentioned, it is at the heart of public confidence in the institutions that we work in, that people should know where councillors and public officials have interests. And, there seemed like some glaringly obvious oversights. Now, even if some of the information under the new regime is no longer published, there is still a requirement, for properties owned to be included in your return. And also, I guess, Chris, a lack of understanding about some of the requirements around trusts and beneficial interests, for example, where people have self-managed superannuation funds.
Yeah, the inspector, Michael Stefanovic, said they did survey the non-compliant councillors and found that there was sort of 2 issues: a lack of understanding of why it was important to do it and they didn't know how to do it, but also a lack of guidance on how to complete returns, as it was legalistic and difficult to understand, which has led to some pretty predictable recommendations, 14 of them, about improving compliance through education and guidance and potentially some legislative change.
Chris, one thing we know about adult learning is that just in time is a good way to go about it. And I think planning to do training with the governance staff who support councillors and councillors concerned just before the returns are due rather than in the induction would probably be a useful thing, because some of it is complex. Anyone that has a self-managed superannuation fund, for example, you have two legal entities, one of which you're the trustee and the other which you have a beneficial interest in. So actually being able to work through and understand it becomes really important.
Very wise advice there, Steve. Hopefully people will take something from that.
There is a coincidence, of course, and it was reported in the media yesterday that the former Prime Minister, Malcolm Turnbull, had some issues in completing his, I've got to get this right, foreign influence register declaration.
Oh.
Because of some difficulties with the federal government website, and there was a public servant helping him, and then when he lost the public servant on the phone, he got put on hold. So,
oh dear.
But it goes to the point that you need to know what you're doing. For anyone, councillors and officers filling these in, you need to take the time. This is not a tick and flick exercise, and those horrendous stats sort of just point to that.
All right, I want to finish on a couple of interstate notes, Steve, because we've been very Victorian focused just for a change this week. But we can't not mention what's happening at Kuringai Council in Sydney. I reported this on the Local Government News Roundup earlier in the week. There were seven. Yes, Steve.
I'm about to say your abacus is getting a real workout on this, isn't it?
Well, at that point there were 7 consecutive instances of the council failing to achieve a quorum and having to adjourn meetings and try again. I believe it's now 8. Most of those apply to attempted meetings to deal with the CEO, the general manager's performance review issues, and the others are about an ordinary meeting. And I understand this stems back to the last mayoral election in September when there was a change of mayor at that council.
Chris, is it fair to say there's a schism in that council, that there's some voting patterns that are routinely adhered to?
I do think that is fair to say. And not surprisingly, the local government watchdog in New South Wales has said publicly they are keeping an eye on what's happening at that council.
Now, we've talked before about calls of the council and things like that. I think it's just a reminder, Chris, that certainly in the Victorian legislation, one of the roles of the councillor is to participate in the decision-making process, which I think is code for turn up at meetings.
It is, and as I think we've talked about before, I've got the distinct honour and pleasure and record memory of having participated in a call of the council process at a governance level. And the other one, which you drew my attention to, is a case of bullying being called out at Bega Valley Shire. Now, there's a clip online. We're not going to play it here, but we'll put a link up in the show notes to show this rather extraordinary incident that played out at that council this week. You've watched it?
I've got to say, Chris, and you and I think we pride ourselves on not being gobsmacked by too much. Probably say gobsmacked too often. But I was gobsmacked by this just in a sense at the speed at which the council meeting just went to custard.
It degenerated very quickly, didn't it?
Is it ever? And it was at a level where, there was a point of order called. One of the councillors said something like, "No, I didn't call you a lunatic. I said you appear to be a lunatic." Now, if you've got that kind of banter going on, the mayor has no hope of restoring order. You've not got a group of people who are going to resolve their differences in a way that's restorative, where everyone's happy about it. And it just struck me as being a worthwhile watch, and also a bit of a sign as to why councils, any group, needs to work early on how they, I think that the buzz phrase at the moment is how to have better disagreements.
Absolutely. And, we've just seen a slice of this council in action. It's only 2 minutes. It's on the ABC News website. I will just make the point, it is an example of a male councillor allegedly bullying a female councillor, and it's the sort of behaviour that we've heard a lot of discussion about as to how we can make it a more even playing field for people to participate in an adult and safe way in the process.
Yeah, we started the session today talking about the great strategic work that a whole lot of councillors have done, which was really pointing to the importance of, being bold, having great ambition, getting the best for communities. That sort of behaviour, we're back to really talking about the obligation for a safe workplace.
All right, Steve, we might wrap it up there. Who knows what we'll be talking about next week. I make the point that nominations for New South Wales Council elections are open as we speak, and they close next Wednesday, so there'll no doubt be some coverage post that of who's put their hand up or who hasn't.
And you've just reminded me that voting closes at 6 p.m. tonight in the South Gippsland Shire, and maybe...
Yes. Thank you for the reminder. We haven't talked about that. Of course, that election, the voting period was extended by a week because 9,000 ballot packs basically didn't get delivered. They went missing and had to be reprinted.
Exactly, and they were reprinted in a different colour, so there's traceability and a surety, I suppose, that the election result is valid and fair.
So we'll probably be talking about that next week, or at least in the next few weeks. Thanks, Steve. Great to talk as always. Another good week in governance land.
Terrific. Thanks, Chris.
Steve Cooper, Chief of Staff at the VLGA. That's the governance update brought to you by Hunt and Hunt Lawyers from VLGA Connect. And we look forward to joining you again very soon. Bye for now.